everything. The diets, the exercise programs, the calorie counting apps, the sheer force of willpower. And every time, the weight would come back. Sometimes more of it than before. The doctor leans forward and says, "I want to try something different." He pulls out a prescription pad. And he writes down a name that, honestly, most people hadn't heard of yet. Ozempic. Now fast forward to today, 2026. That name is everywhere. It's in the news, in your social media feed, in conversations at dinner tables and doctors' offices and boardrooms. And this past week alone, the story around these drugs exploded in 3 completely unexpected directions at once. So let's talk about it. Because what's happening with GLP-1 medications right now is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and genuinely important health stories in decades. And there's a lot to unpack. First, let me back up for just a second and explain what these drugs actually are. Because the name GLP-1 sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, and the abbreviation doesn't exactly help. GLP-1 stands for glucagon, like peptide 1, which, yes, is a mouthful. But here's the simple version. It's a hormone your body naturally produces when you eat. It tells your brain you're full. It slows down how quickly food leaves your stomach. It helps regulate blood sugar. And it does a bunch of other things that scientists are still, frankly, figuring out. For decades, researchers knew this hormone existed. They knew it played a role in appetite and metabolism. But making a drug that mimics it? That was the hard part. The breakthrough came in an unlikely place: the saliva of a Gila monster lizard. A researcher in the 1990s discovered that this reptile's saliva contained a compound that acted a lot like GLP-1 in the human body. And that discovery, strange as it sounds, eventually led to the development of a whole new class of medications. Ozempic came first, approved initially for type 2 diabetes. Then came Wegovy, same active ingredient, higher dose, approved specifically for weight loss. Then Mounjaro, then Zepbound. Each one building on the last. Each one showing results that genuinely surprised the medical community. People weren't just losing a few pounds, they were losing 20, 30, 40 pounds or more. Consistently, in clinical trials. In the real world, over and over again. And that's when things got interesting. Now here's something that happened this week that I think is genuinely a turning point in this whole story. The EFTA just approved the first GLP-1 pill for weight loss. Because here's the thing, up until now, these medications have been delivered by injection, a weekly shot, usually in the stomach or thigh. And for a lot of people, that's been the barrier. The needles, the weekly routine, the fact that you need to keep it refrigerated, the whole production of it. And I get it. There are millions of people who would absolutely try this medication, who might genuinely benefit from it, but who have looked at that little pen injector and thought, you know what? No, that's not for me. The pill changes that equation entirely. Novo Nordisk, the company behind Ozempic and Wegovy, got EFTA approval for an oral version of semaglutide for weight management. And Eli Lilly, the company behind Zepbound, is expected to follow with their own oral GLP-1 in the not-too-distant future. Think about what this means. Instead of a weekly injection, we're potentially talking about a daily pill. Something you can throw in your bag. Something that doesn't require a sharps container. Something that feels, for lack of a better word, normal. Now, the pill form does work a little differently than the injection. The dosing is higher because oral bioavailability, basically how much of the drug actually makes it into your bloodstream when you swallow it versus inject it, is lower. And you have to take it on an empty stomach, which requires a bit of planning. But the clinical results have been promising. This is a big deal, not just for patients, but for the entire trajectory of where this class of drugs is headed. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. A few weeks ago, a study landed in the medical literature that made researchers stop and stare at the data for a moment, just to make sure they were reading it correctly. The study looked at health records from more than 600,000 patients, a massive data set. And what they were looking for was, are there any? differences in health outcomes between people who are taking GLP-1 medications and people who aren't. They expected to find the usual stuff: weight, blood sugar, cardiovascular markers. What they did not expect to find was this. People taking GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic were showing significantly lower rates of substance use disorders: alcohol addiction, nicotine, cocaine, opioids. Across the board, people on these medications were less likely to struggle with addiction than comparable patients who weren't taking them. Now, I want to be careful here, because science moves slowly for a reason, and one study, even a big one, doesn't prove causation. Researchers are still working to understand what's actually going on, but the signal is strong enough that it's sparked a wave of new research into whether GLP-1 medications might have applications far beyond weight loss. There are a few theories. One is that these drugs act on the brain's reward system, the same system that plays a central role in addiction. GLP-1 receptors exist in the brain, not just in the gut and pancreas. And some researchers think the drugs may be dampening the dopamine response to pleasurable things: food, yes, but possibly also alcohol, nicotine, and other substances. There's actually been anecdotal evidence of this for years. People on Ozempic saying they just stopped wanting to drink as much, or that cigarettes suddenly seemed less appealing, or that the compulsive pull towards certain behaviors had quieted down. Doctors noticed it. Patients noticed it. But nobody quite knew what to make of it. Now there's data to back it up. If this holds up, and that's a big if, but an exciting if, we could be looking at a class of medications that addresses not just obesity, but a whole constellation of conditions rooted in dysregulated brain chemistry. The implications are staggering. And then, because apparently this week just had a lot going on, there's the price story. GLP-1 medications have been notoriously expensive. Like, eye-wateringly, jaw-droppingly expensive. We're talking about $1,000 a month or more out of pocket for a lot of people. Insurance coverage has been inconsistent. Medicare only recently started covering them for certain conditions. And for millions of Americans who could benefit, the cost has simply been a wall. But something is happening in the market right now that is genuinely unusual in the pharmaceutical world. Prices are coming down. And not in the gradual, barely noticeable way that sometimes happens years after a drug goes generic. Prices are coming down now for brand-name medications that are still under patent, driven by a mix of factors that have created a kind of perfect storm of competitive pressure. Part of it is the compounding pharmacies. During the period when brand-name GLP-1s were in short supply, the FDA allowed compounding pharmacies, the kind that mix custom medications, to make their own versions at lower cost. The shortage has since been resolved, and the FDA has moved to restrict that practice, but it created a cash pay market that changed what people thought these drugs were worth. Part of it is competition between manufacturers. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are both fighting hard for market share, and that's creating downward pressure on list prices in ways we don't usually see. And part of it is just public and political attention. When a medication becomes this visible, when it's being talked about in Congress, in the White House, on every news network, the pricing becomes a story in itself. And companies respond to that. This is genuinely rare. Drug prices in America almost never go down. And when they do, it's usually because a generic has entered the market after a patent expires, not because of competitive dynamics among brand-name drugs. The fact that it's happening here, now, is something worth paying attention to. So where does all of this leave us? I think about that woman in the doctor's office back in 2021. The one who'd tried everything. The one who'd been struggling for decades. She's not alone. 40% of American adults have obesity, billions of people worldwide. And for most of human history, we've treated it as a failure of willpower, a moral failing, a personal weakness. Diet harder, exercise more, just want it enough. What these drugs are revealing, slowly, imperfectly, with plenty of complications still to work through, is that the story was never that simple. That hunger and appetite, and the way our brains respond to food and pleasure and reward, are biological. They're medical. They're not character flaws. And now we have medications that can change those biological signals. Meaningfully. Measurably. Is this the whole answer? No. The side effects are real. The access is still unequal. The long-term data is still being collected. There are real questions about what happens when people stop taking these drugs, about muscle loss, about how they interact with other conditions. This is not a simple story, but it is a story that is moving fast. Faster, maybe, than any drug story I can think of in recent memory. New delivery methods, unexpected benefits, prices shifting, millions of people whose lives are being materially changed. This week was just another chapter. But it was a big one. And if you're watching this and thinking, okay, but what does this mean for me? Here's what I'd say. Talk to a doctor you trust. Not your neighbor, not a podcast, not a social media influencer, an actual clinician who knows your full history and can weigh the risks and benefits for your specific situation, because the science on these drugs is genuinely exciting. And it's also genuinely evolving. And the best thing any of us can do, patients, doctors, policymakers, all of us, is stay curious, stay honest about what we don't know yet, and keep paying attention. Because this story is far from over. A little hormone, found first in a lizard's saliva, turned into a weekly injection, now becoming a daily pill, possibly treating addiction, getting cheaper by the month. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next video. Okay, so picture this. It's 2021. A doctor in New York is going over a patient's chart. A woman in her mid-40s who's been struggling with her weight for most of her adult life. She's tried everything: the diet,